I have a question for Myra. Hi. My question is I was very curious about, have you been looking at the research of Shireen El-Feki, who's doing surveys of big groups of men in Palestine, Lebanon, Egypt, Kuwait, and it's, I don't know if you, are you familiar with Shireen El-Feki's work?
I haven't looked at that work. No.
It's a new, well, it's relatively like, I guess it's like over a year old now, or less than that. And she's been doing it for Promundo, which is a Brazilian NGO that has a big interest in men. But what was interesting to me was that El-Feki had come from, you know her work, Sex in the Citadel. So she was really looking at women for a very long time. And then she said that she felt that the women had the more interesting stories, and they were more interesting to hang out with, and they were more fun. But really, the fixing of society, you had to go look at the men. So I was just sort of curious about when you were talking, gender as a construct, definitely. But I was just sort of interested about that balance and like you prefer one over the other or they're together.
Well, Shireen El-Feki in her work in general tends to be very essentialist. And
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last thing you said.
It tends to be very essential, like, well, you know, like dividing people in that binary and through, like, you know, roles that they should embody. But, and my personal approach says that we should destroy gender. However, that the idea of looking at men's experiences and addressing them. I think Bell Hooks again says that feminists have failed men. I don't know how much I agree with that, but it is very important to see those experiences and the changes that are happening to their roles and how we can go from there in order to destroy gender.
Can I ask another question? I'm sorry. Can I just ask one more? Dalia, I was very curious about the use of color in your comics, because I definitely noticed when you were the notebook of men's experience, definitely the colors change as opposed to the children's experiences that are very rich, not all pastel colors, but the green, the pink. And I was sort of curious if you could, or I was wondering if you could talk about the use of color in your work, what it signifies. Is it only for mood, or is there I don't know, an aesthetics at work that you're honing in on?
Yeah. My experience working in the refugee camps here in Lebanon, I always felt like the biggest two colors is dust and the white tents. So I always, my visual memory about this refugee camps, it's like this. So even when I go there and I do murals for kids, they are really thirsty for any kind of like colors. So sometimes they just steal the paint from me and they put it in their hair, their face, their clothes and everything, because they spend a long time under the sun. So even their clothes, they lose their colors. So I always see this environment is like, it needs a lot of colors, usually.
Thank you.
Did I answer?
Yeah.
I gathered, Tanya, you're trying to be, I mean, I don't know, I hope so, but you're trying to be a bit disruptive in terms of how academia usually works. So I noticed the article was open access and the work that you're doing, and you were very critical in your talk about how nobody reads those peer-reviewed journals. They're very closed off. I don't know who access, like universities probably are the only ones who have access to them. So if you can talk a bit more about particularly your experience, like coming from Europe and working in a context that is here, and how you can still try to be disruptive of how the academic system works in terms of So you're forced to publish in peer-reviewed journals because that goes into the promotion and the tenure, but at the same time, the gates to knowledge are closed off. Nobody has access to them except it's an ivory tower. So if you can talk more about that experience, like particularly in the context of Lebanon or even the Arab region, and even with the experience that you've had now, I didn't quite understand your target audience. Was it to test this with the adolescents themselves, or I was a bit confused as to who was your target audience with the book.
Me? Yes, there, okay. Thank you for your questions. Yeah, so firstly, I think there was a study that found that like 20% of published literature gets actually read, and it's read by other academics in the same field. So this is really problematic for clinical psychologists. So my role is really part in community and part in academia. And it's really hard to do that, actually, because in the clinical world, that's all you do. In the academic world, that's all you do. So matching those two things is really difficult here or elsewhere. I'm not sure it's that different. But in some ways, I think it's even been easier for me here because of some of the structural differences in provision of services and lack of mental health services in general. And so that gives some creativity to more grassroots projects to do things a bit differently. So that opens the doors for psychologists to have access to populations to do things a bit more in an innovative way. You don't have to go through massive bureaucratic structures necessarily. So for example, the pilot that I'm doing now is with the Family Guidance Center, who are an NGO, a local NGO, and that's, I can just work with them, and I can have this idea, and we can work on it together, and we can develop it together. So there's more room for creativity. That's what I found here that I've really enjoyed. And I'm not sure that this project would have developed so quickly in the way that it did if I had been in Northern Ireland, for example, still. So there's massive benefits and advantages actually to that. There's many disadvantages, but that's one of the advantages. And then to answer your second question about the focus groups, I went over it really quickly there. But essentially what we're planning is that we want to make sure that this, before we kind of try and publish or print this book, I would like it to be kind of freely accessible, as with the research, open access. So I need to make sure that people understand it. Adolescents themselves who have experienced conflict, who have experienced adversity and disadvantage. And this is the population that is served by the Family Guidance Center. So my idea is to have a number of different focus groups with both the adolescents and their families, because their families are implicated. I'm kind of, the book is for adolescents, but it's also a message for parents and communities to support adolescents. So I'd like it to be something that we read together, and then we ask them about what they think of the book and how we could do it better. And are there things, it really amazed me when I tried to do this in illustrations about how difficult that is and how many assumptions you make. Does she wear a scarf or not? How old should she be? Does she look that old? What should she wear? What does the street look like? I tried to make it kind of a little non-specific to one place, but that's really hard to do in a picture, and most of it looks like Palestine, which is what I used as a lot of the references. So that experience, I just really told me that, okay, there must be some European bias in here somewhere, and I need to make sure that the main messages are still communicated despite the biases of the person who's illustrating. So that's the main purpose, to talk to adolescents themselves.
I'm wondering if, I'm guessing the next panel would talk more about this, but since a lot of the work that's being done is through NGOs, I'm wondering if you could reflect a bit more about this idea, I think it was Arundhati who talked about it, the NGOization of resistance, and how having all of these NGOs is sort of sucking up all this resistance that could go into fighting systems and regimes and all of this. I really wish Beeta could have been here. I would have wanted to talk to her, to ask her more about this. But I'm wondering if you could reflect more on how in a way, you're part of the system because this is the reality and you're trying to sort of create change, but from within. But this is still questionable as to the limits of how far we can go by changing from within without a critical disruption that happens. So I'm wondering if the three of you could talk a bit more, because all of you are somehow involved in it. And also, Myra, if you can talk a bit more about this push. No, I'm asking all of you, but
We think
at the end, like if Myra could talk a bit more about this, this push in a way to also disrupt in a way, I don't know, academia by pushing sort of this kind of work, the illustrations, the research by comics, and which is also what Tania is trying to do, like this sort of making knowledge more accessible through this medium.
I will just talk very fast and give it to Myra. No, I'm kidding. So, like NGOs, mostly they have standards, and they don't really like to talk about politics, but sometimes it's really very annoying, because once like I drew something and I did the graffiti on the wall, like Harriya, freedom. And they said, oh yeah, everything is nice, but like, why you talk about politics? And I was like, freedom now is politics? Like, I was really shocked. So I told them I'm not going to remove it. So they accepted this in the end. But even with this Bukra Inshallah book, because I talked about like how like Lebanese army, they treat men and they call them ISIS, and they said like we don't know if we can publish this because it's like it's talking about politics again. But yeah, sometimes even if they have standards, you can really crush this, break these standards and put your own ideas. And freedom is not politics.
And it's basic. So when I was preparing this presentation, I started just taking note of all the comics that were done, that were commissioned by NGOs. And at some point I stopped. You had like Solidarité Internationale, which did Bukra Inshallah, but you also had Care Network, Norwegian People's Aid, Amnesty, UN agencies, like so many of them, ESRC, Médecins Sans Frontières, and you had like so many of those, which on one side you understand, like, on the one side that puts in resources to create those things, because you need money, like artists and like comics artists need to live. But on the other hand, it limits and kind of directs, curates what ends up being said. Which is why, for example, in research by comics, we're very conflicted about how to deal with money and how to create something that could be sustainable but not rely on NGO funding, for example. The NGO funding also means that, well, because there are sometimes calls for proposals for just like projects in general, they end up kind of giving you ideas on what to work on. And what approach to have for gender, for example. And you know, I personally, and I think all Lebanese people have that conflicting, like that really complex relationship with NGOs, because they're taking on the work that should be done by governments, that we would elect and kind of have oversight on it. But on the other hand, they are employing like so it's kind of, you know. Anyway, now with the funding starting to get a bit tricky, who knows what will happen. As for the academia, that idea that 20% of the academic articles are read by other people in the field, only those are read and they're read by people in the field. Think about when we're talking about the region, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and all that. They are very rarely written in Arabic. When they are, it's in a complex Arabic. They are often translated, not just in academia, but in reports and all that. They are often translated from English. The academics tend to work in foreign institutions. Like, for example, I am doing my PhD in France. So because because of lots of reasons. Lots of people end up working or at least studying there and publishing there. So our idea in Research by Comics was to take research done by people who are here that is done on us in our community, in our society, and to try and give it back to ourselves in a way that would be accessible. So, because the whole point of doing research for most of the people who do research is to actually change something, like to help us understand how we can change things to the better. And so we need to actually tell the people what we found in order for it to matter. So yeah, that's what we're doing in Research by Comics, and I think we should talk and we should talk. Oh, you have some.
I just wanted to add something. I totally agree with from the academic perspective, but maybe also from the clinical perspective, because this is one of my major frustrations of working clinically in general with socially disadvantaged communities who are more affected by mental health problems. And the reason for that is because social disadvantage and inequality and injustice has a massive effect on our well-being and the rate of mental disorders that we experience. And so as psychologists, I get very frustrated that so many of our interventions are one-to-one. And maybe if you're lucky, you will involve family members, but they very rarely try to advocate or change the structures that are causing the problems in the first place. And this is really a massive frustration of mine in general in my field. And so I hope that we can push, perhaps by like this kind of interdisciplinary way of working, to try to change the way we think about these interventions and at least have some other influence and advocacy, at least, that these injustices are the causal problems and not just something overarching that we just can't even touch.